Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin Daf Pei Vav. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started with the story of Rabbi Chia from the previous daf. So he had moths in his clothing, and he went to Rebbe, and Rebbe said, just slaughter a bird, and the blood will, use the blood to get rid of the moths. To which the Gemara said, how could he do that, right? What do you mean? Didn't he have to cover the blood? To which we explained that Rebbe said either. We had two versions, go out and make it a treifa, or go out and stab it. And now the Gemara is trying to figure out why would you prefer one version over the other? So we tried to say the one who says say trof, why didn't he say say nechor? We suggested maybe it's because shchita there's no shchita la'of min Torah, and nechira, it actually is the way to slaughter it properly, and then you would be obligated in kisoy hadam. However, we rejected that because we said in the Braita, we saw the Rebbe says kasher tziviticha means that nitztaveh Moshe ala veshet v'ala kaneh, that it is by Torah law. So the Gemara answers in the end. Here we're going to explain it. Really, he could have said say nechor. The reason why he said say trof is lo mebaya kamra. Lo mebaya means he really meant both. Okay, you could either do stabbing it or make it a treifa, but he specifically said the one that was a bigger chidush. It wasn't as obvious. Lo mebaya say nechor delav shchita klal. You don't even need to say say nechor, which isn't even shchita. Aval say trof em shchita sheina ruya shma shchita v'libaya kisoy. You might have thought, though, that say trof wouldn't be good here because say trof maybe Rebbe holds that shchita that's not a good shchita is still called shchita, meaning a shchita of a treifa would still be called shchita, and you might need to do kisoy adam, and maybe that's why you didn't say trof. And that's why what we're saying now is you might have thought, or in other words, Rabbi Chia might have thought that he can't do that. That's why Rebbe specifically told him, no. Kamash malan kid Rabbi Chia bar Abba. What he was trying to say is, right, the person who claims that that's what Rebbe said is that Rebbe was teaching him exactly what Rabbi Chia bar Abba said about Rebbe, which is that Rebbe, right, when on Daf Pehei we saw this on the previous daf, that Rebbe basically put the opinion of Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah as if it was the rabbi's opinion that shchita of a treifa, right, is still going to be obligated in kisoy hadam, right? It's not obligated in kisoy hadam. It's not shchita, and it's not obligated. Okay, so that's why he said, go out and make it a treifa because you won't have to do kisoy hadam. Ulamanda amart say nechor, my time alo amart say trof. Now we're going to do the reverse. The one who said say nechor, why didn't he say trof? Why did he say go stab it? Why didn't he say go make it a treifa? The chitim, they're going to do the exact same thing here. If you want to say this, it's not that, and in the end they're going to say it's a lo mabaya, it's actually both. But if you want to say kasavar, and this is it's going like the reverse order of the previous section. If you want to say shchita she'ena ruyashma shchita, maybe he held that a shchita that's of a treifa is actually a valid shchita, and you would still need kisoy. And that's why you didn't say trof. But you can't say that because of Rabbi Chia bar Abba. V'hama Rabbi Chia bar Abba amar Rabbi Yochanan. ראה רבי את דבריו של רבי שמעון בכיסוי אדם ושנאו בלשון חכמים, right? He saw Rabbi Shimon said about this, that you're not obligated in kisui adam if you slaughtered a treifa, and put it in the language of the chachamim, because that was the standard opinion. So obviously, if you had done state trof, right, if you had treifed it up, you wouldn't have to do kisui adam, and that would work as well. So that's not a good answer. So in the end, they're going to say lo mebaya kamar. It's a lo mebaya structure, meaning you don't need this, but even this. Lo mebayat say trof d'shchita she'ena ruya lo shma shchita, and that's obvious to everyone because that was pretty clear from Rabbi Chia bar Abba. That, of course, right now in the previous we just said that was the big chidush. Here we're saying no. Everybody knows that it's not shchita. Aval say nechor, you might have thought, now it's exact reverse order of the previous. Ein shchita la'of min haTorah nechirato zo shchitato libay kisui. You might have thought though that maybe Rebbe holds that shchita of a bird is not by Torah law, it's only rabbinic. Kamash malan kasher tziviticha. In the end, they learned no, because it says kasher tziviticha, Moshe's referencing, right, or God's referencing in the pasuk, like Moshe was already taught about shchita of a bird. Okay, and that's why either which one would be an option according to both these versions. Now, before we finish the sugya and move on to the next Mishnah, we have a side point to deal with. And I say side point because it has nothing to do with Kisoy Adam. It has to do with this story. Umi nafale yaniva bekitanai. How did he end up with moths in his flax? V'hamar Rabin bar Abba v'amri l'hamar Rabbi Avin bar Shaba misha'alu b'nei agola pasku azikim v'asvaot v'aruchot v'aramim Okay, we're now going to see one of these rabbis said that once the people in the Galut, meaning in Babylonia, made Aliyah to Eretz Israel, which we're going to see is not talking about in the time of Ezra or anything like that. We're talking about in this time period, in the time of Rabbi Chia and his sons. In a minute, you'll see that inside. When they went on Aliyah, all these good things happened in Israel. Okay, they stopped having zikin, which are shooting stars, zvaot, which are earthquakes, ruchot, terrible winds, ramim, thunders. Okay, things that are disastrous to the people stopped happening, and lo echmitzienam, their wine didn't spoil, and lo lakapshtanam, their flax didn't get ruined, meaning it didn't get moth infested. So, and then they say, and the rabbis looked around and saw Rabbi Chia and his sons, and they said they're responsible for this. So they're such tzaddikim, righteous people, that when they came, all these good things happened, or bad things stopped happening. So how could it possibly be that of all people, Rabbi Chia had flax, right? Besides that this didn't happen to anyone, all the more so it wouldn't happen to Rabbi Chia if he brought this blessing. To which they answer, a very interesting answer, which requires thinking about. Ki mahaniz chutayu alma, adid hulo. Now, while it might have worked for the world, it didn't work for them. Okay, the zchuyot that they had, their merits, were good for everybody else, but not actually for them. And where do we have a precedent for this? From a sugya in Ta'anit. Ta'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Kid Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, like Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav. Ta'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, as Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav. Bechol yom vayom bat kol yotzeit v'omeret. Every day, a heavenly voice comes down and says, Kol ha'olam kulon nizom b'shvil Chananya b'ni. God says the whole world is getting sustenance because of Chananya, my son. This is Chanina, my son, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa. But he is satisfied with one carob from week to week, meaning he has nothing. Okay, now he might be satisfied with it, but that's really nothing. Okay, he is not blessed with food. So everybody else gets food and sustenance except for him. Okay, so it's a very interesting question why that would be. Why someone who has so many merits that can merit for everybody else, but they don't necessarily get for themselves. It's a very good question. Okay, something to think about. Now the Mishnah starts off with Cheresh Shoteva Katan. This is going to be our topic for the rest of today. Cheresh Shoteva Katan. So we have these three people that are considered they don't have knowledge. We learned about them in the beginning of the Masechet. Their shchita is not valid, but if somebody's watching it, then their shchita is valid. So if shachatu va'achirim ro'in otam. So if they slaughtered and other people are watching, chayav lechasot. You have to do kisoy adam because the shchita is good. If the shchita is good, it needs kisoy adam. Beinam levin atzman. But if they just do it on their own, patur milachasot. They don't have to cover the blood because it wasn't a valid shchita. V'chein, and likewise, le'idyan otovet b'no. Same thing with the commandment of otovet b'no. Sheshachatu v'acharim ro'in otam asur l'shchot achareihem. If you slaughter an animal, for katan chereshoter or katan slaughters an animal, and then other people weren't watching, then shachatu v'acharim ro'in otam asur l'shchot achareihem. If people were watching, then it's a valid shchita, and then you can't slaughter its mother or its offspring. But beinam lebein atzmam, but if they're just among themselves, the cheresh shoteva katan with no adult watching, Rabbi Meir matir l'shchot acharihen. So Rabbi Meir says, just like there's no kisoy adam, there's no prohibition of otovet b'no. You can go slaughter the mother that day if you want, or the child. The chachamim oslim, but the rabbis forbid. Now notice there's some lack of symmetry in this Mishnah, because in the first case, the rabbis didn't forbid. Why didn't they say obligate, right? They would have obligated in Kisoy Adam. Here they forbid, and Rashi says it's because they're in doubt. Maybe their slaughter was good. If their slaughter was good, then you have a prohibition of Otovet B'no. Now, why wouldn't they say that in the first case? Good question. The Gemara is obviously going to ask that question. Umudim. Now, the rabbis agree, though, she'im shachat she'no sofeget arba'im, that if they did slaughter, they don't get lashes for it. Okay? In other words, if you slaughter the mother, since it's only in doubt, and Rashi points out, it's what we call a hatra'at safek. You can't warn a person. If you can't warn a person in a clear manner, it's not a warning. So if you say to the person, listen, it's possible that their shchita was good, in which case you're going to be going against the Torah prohibition, that's not a valid warning. And therefore, they won't be able to get punished for it. So now the Gemara starts off with the obvious question for Rabbanan, Maishna Resha Delo Pligi, or Maishna Sefer De Pligi. Why do the rabbis only disagree in only disagree in the second part and not the first part? Why don't they say you also have to do Kisoy Adam? Because maybe right? It was a valid shchita. So we're going to have a ping pong try to answer the question, okay? Because we're going to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Reisha, if you say that you have to cover the blood, then people will say, that must be a valid shchita, because if I had to cover the blood, it must have been the slaughter was valid. And then people will end up eating from that meat, thinking it was a good kosher shchita. Okay, that's why in the Reisha, the rabbis don't say, oh, you have to cover the blood, because everyone will think, kosher meat, and eat it, right? So now they say, Seifa nami, what do you mean? Be the same concern with the Seifa. Since the rabbis say you can't slaughter the mother after that, or the son after that, or the daughter, same thing. People say, if the prohibition exists for the mother or the offspring, then it must be, it was good shchita, and they'll come to eat animal. That's not a good differentiation. Says, no, it is. Because Seifa Amrei Bisra de lo Kamebayale. Let's look at the situation. In the Seifa, the fact that you can't slaughter the mother, people will just say, oh, why didn't they slaughter the mother? Because they were not interested in having meat that day. Okay, they were being vegetarians that day, or just didn't need any meat, or had a different animal to slaughter. But when you cover the blood and you do an actual action, then everyone will see, oh, you covered the blood. They'll realize, oh, obviously it was a kosher shchita. But it's not as noticeable because there's a lack of action going on with Otoveh. But no, you're just not going to do something. Who knows why you didn't do it? There could be millions of reasons why you didn't do it. But they say no, because same thing with the Reisha. You could say Reisha nami, Amri l'naker chatzerot sarich. After you slaughter an animal, there's lots of blood. Maybe you covered the blood because you wanted to clean up, right? People will see you covering the blood. They won't think, oh, they're doing it because of the mitzvah. They'll think you're doing it to clean up who wants blood on their floor of their courtyard. So then they say no, but still there could be a few cases where there's a differentiation. Shachat b'ashpa ma'ika lememar. What if it's a case where you slaughtered it into the garbage dump? Now, if you cover the blood there, everyone's going to know it's because of the mitzvah. Or bali malech. Or if you asked a rabbi, do I have to cover the blood? And the rabbi says yes, well, then it's going to be clear that you're doing it for the mitzvah. So ma'ika lememar, what are you going to say? So here we have cases where there are definitely some cases where it's going to be definitely clear that you're only doing it for the mitzvah. And that would differentiate between case A and case B. But the Gemara still says, no. Well, then what about Otoveh B'no? If you're the rabbi's position, you said it's forbidden. What if someone goes to the rabbi and asks? Now that they asked, right? So you're going to say, if the rabbi says, oh yeah, you can't slaughter the mother, then everyone's going to think the animal's kosher, slaughter. So that's going to be a problem. So now we're back to saying they're really one and the same. So why do the rabbis only disagree in the second case and not the first? To which they say, we misunderstood. Ela Rabbanana Kula Milta Pligi. The rabbis clearly disagree about the whole thing. They waited till Rabbi Meir finished. Okay, if you notice the beginning part, I'll read through the Mishnah again so you see. Okay, the beginning of the Mishnah is said without anybody's name. Other people see them. You have to cover. But if there's no adult watching, then you don't have to. First of all, it says, and so the same thing. Now, it's hard to say it's the same thing when there's a disagreement. Okay, and I think that's a big of a strength for this reading. Same thing for Otoveh B'no. If other people saw, you can't do it. But and there's Rabbi Meir. Now they're going to basically say, until that point, it was all Rabbi Meir talking. Then come Chachamim, and Chachamim Osrim, and it means Chachamim Osrim there, and they're Mechayev Kisoy Adam, they obligate you in Kisoy Adam in the first part. Okay, that's true. And they just waited till Rabbi Meir finished everything, and then they brought their dissenting opinion. Okay, now we're going to ask a question. Bishlama Rabbanan L'chum. Okay, so the rabbi's position actually makes sense. They're being stringent. Let's be stringent and say you have to cover the blood, and you're obligated in Otoveh B'no. Ela Rabbi Meir, my time, but what's Rabbi Meir's reason for being lenient? Maybe really they did have a good shchita. Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mechayev Haya Rabbi Meir al shchitatan mishum nevela. So Rabbi Yaakov says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, okay, now this is an interesting thing. Even though they're lenient in the Mishnah, and they say, no kisoy adam, right? Don't need to do that. No prohibition of Otoveh B'no. It actually stems from a strict law. their stringency. They say the shchita v'cheres shota v'katan is like an avela. You're obligated if you eat it for eating not kosher food. Okay? Prohibition. Okay? You violated a prohibition by doing that. Now, my time, but why does he think this? Why was he so strict about that, right? You see here, sometimes you have stringencies that lead to leniencies. The stringency, that's why it's like two sides of the same coin. If you say it's a valid shchita, then you have to do kisur adam. You have to be stringent in that. If you say it's not a valid shchita and it's not kosher, then well, you can't eat it, but you also don't have to cover the blood, and you also aren't obligated for a tovah. But no. So Rabbi Meir has both a chumrah and a kula to it. Okay, a leniency and a stringency. So now they're going to ask, what's his reason? So they say, my timer. Why is he? So we got that the reason why our Mishnah is based on the fact he says it's nevela. But why does he say it's nevela? If a cheresh shota v'katan, maybe they did it right. So he says the following: Amar Rabbi Ami, ho'il u'maasehem v'rov maasehem mikulkalim. Most cheshim, okay, deaf mutes, shotes, okay, where they don't have sound, not of sound mind, and katan, minors. Most of them don't know what they're doing when it comes to shchita and ruin the shchita. Okay? So now that's his answer. We have a rove. Okay, besides we have a rove, we also have the chazaka that an animal, until proven it was slaughtered properly, is not kosher. So take the rove, put it together with that, for sure, you're not going to say it's a valid shchita. Well, Rav Papa, the Rav Huna Breder Rav Yeshua, Rav Huna Breder Rav Yeshua, the Rav Papa, one of them said it to the other, we're not sure who said to who. My area rove, afilu miyut nami. Wait a minute. Don't you remember Rabbi Meir Chayish L'miyuta? Rabbi Meir is the guy who takes into consideration minorities. So why did you have to say that the majority of them are messing up their slaughters? Why don't you just say even if the minority of them are doing it, it would still lead to saying not kosher? Why? In other words, if you follow majority, then you would need the majority. But Rabbi Meir follows minority, you'd say, well, if the minority do non-kosher slaughters, then you have to assume this was the minority of non-kosher slaughters. Also because we could say, smoch miyuta lechazaka v'itra laruba. If you say, majority do bad slaughters, majority do good slaughters. But remember, majority, minority of chershim, ktanim, and shotim. Now, even if you say only a minority do bad slaughters, and there's the majority against that, but still, first of all, Rabbi Meir is concerned for minority, but more so, there's a chazaka, as I said before, that animals are not kosher until proven that they were kosher, slaughtered kosher. So, right, their chazaka, their presumptive status is not kosher, because when they're alive, they're not kosher. So, why wouldn't you say that would override a rove, even if rove did a great job slaughtering? It wouldn't even help. And how do we know that this is how he holds? Because, right, so Rabbi Meir in general is choshesh from miyut, and you can add the miyut to that, and itra l'ruba ditnan, as it says in a Mishnah. Here we're going to learn a Mishnah about a funny kind of situation, especially as a mother in the kitchen. So you have a kid, a little kid, who's sitting there in the kitchen. You walk into your kitchen, and what do you see? I left my dough to rise, and now I find my kid with his hand full of dough and the dough. Okay, so I have the dough and the kid with the hand with the dough in it. Do I have to worry that the dough is impure? Now, why would the dough be impure? Well, it depends. So Rabbi Meir Mitaher, he says your dough is totally fine. Chachamim mitamim mipnei shedarko shel tinok l'tapeach. He says, listen, kids touch everything. We all know that. Kids go around, little kids, they touch everything, which means the kids hang out in the garbage dump and they touch things in the garbage dump. And there's nevelas in the garbage dump which have impurity. There's dead shratzim, creatures in the garbage dump which have. Kids are just touching everything. We assume most kids are impure. So my time of the Rebbe Meir. So if the kids are impure, and we know they touch the dough because they have dough on their hands, so the rest of the dough is going to be impure. So that explains the rabbis. So what about Rabbi Meir? Kasaval, he holds rov tinokot mitapchim umiut e mitapchim. So he agrees that most kids touch things in garbage dumps, but minority don't. Now, if you hold by the minority, you go like this. Isazo b'cheskat ta'ara omedet. The opposite of our case. Ours was b'cheskat not kasher. This is b'cheskat kasher. And we have a minority of kids, and it's b'cheskat tahor. Until this was proven otherwise, right? There was nothing wrong with this isa. It wasn't impure. So number one, it's b'cheskat ta'ara. And we have the mi'ut that don't touch things. So samach mi'uta turning out on bet, samach mi'uta lechazaka ve'itra laruba. Put the mi'ut together with the chazaka. And what do you have? Tahor. Minority don't touch things. The Presumptive status is it's fine, it's tahor, it's pure. So let's put those together and that should override the majority. So just like it works there to permit this, shouldn't it work in our case to say, and what are we trying to say? Let's just get it clear. That if the minority are messing up their slaughters, and we already have presumptive status that it's not kosher, then that should lead us to say it's an avela. And why did Rabbi Meir have to say, or why they explain Rabbi Meir is saying the majority mess up? Even in a minority, it would have been messed up. So they say, Im amru safek tumah l'taher, yamru safek isur lahatil. Tumah is a whole different story. Tuma is much easier to say, Safek, let's be lenient. Why? Well, first of all, we have this whole thing is learned from Sota, if you remember. Safek in Rishut Yachid, only in a private domain, are we going to rule more stringently on a Safek and say it's impure. In the public domain, we're going to rule it's fine. And that's because the Sota is all in private. Now, the Sota, right, she's maybe nitma'ah, maybe she slept with the man or not, and it's only when she was alone in a room with him. Well, also, one other thing they learn about Sota is if they have enough knowledge to ask. Right? If you could ask them, now they might not tell you the answer, but it has to be a case where we're going to be stringent if you could have asked the person. Now, in this case, you couldn't. It was a tinok. You couldn't ask the tinok, but the tinok wouldn't know how to answer. Did you put your hands in the garbage? They're not going to answer you. So that's in Safek Tuma. We can be lenient. But Safek Isur Lahatil. But now, what are they going to basically say here? If we follow this whole thing, then what are you going to say? Safek Isur is going to be permitted, meaning, well, wasn't the whole thing we were trying to say that meat's not kosher? If the meat's not kosher, what does Rabbi Meir say? Then that means there's no obligation of kisoy adam, and there's no obligation of otov et beno. So you're going to end up being lenient on something. We're not going to say lenient based on a minority. No way, no how. So because this has two sides, Rabbi Meir is actually strict, okay? But it's not going to help, right? In the end, he's strict, which creates a leniency, though. So we're not going to allow that based on only a minority, only if there's a majority. And that's why they explain Rabbi Meir is saying the majority of kids don't know how to slaughter. Okay? So now we want to know, who do we hold like? So Hora Rebbe ke Rabbi Meir. Hora Rebbe ke Chachamim. Okay, Rebbe in one case, Pascal like Rabbi Meir, that the slaughtering of this child is an avela, or one of those three categories is a nevela, and maybe also you don't have to do kisoy adam, and it's not chayav and otov et beno. In a different case, he held like the rabbis that it's not an avela, and it is obligated in kisoy, and it is obligated in otov et beno. So now they say, hey minayu dacharita. Well, which was the last one he said? Because we want to know what he held, right? Obviously, he changed his mind at some point. Which one was last? So they're going to bring a source, which is very strange because the source doesn't actually even try to come to an answer. Forget about often we bring a source and then reject it. This source doesn't even give us an answer, but it does tell us a bit of a story about this. So let's hear the story, and then we'll get to another source, which actually gives us an answer. Tashma, let's learn from here. De Rabbi Abba bered de Rabbi Chia bar Abba, the Rabbi Zera. Okay, Rabbi Abba, note who he is. He's the son of Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Now, let's just remember the beginning of our daf. Rabbi Chia bar Abba quoted Rabbi Yochanan about Rebbe in the Mishnah. Okay? So let's just remember that Rabbi Chia bar Abba often quotes Rabbi Yochanan. That's going to come up in this story. But this is his son, Rabbi Abba. And him and Rabbi Zera, okay, two rabbis from Israel. Rabbi Zera, if you remember, made Aliyah. But they're both in Israel. Have a kaima b'shuka de Kesari. So they're sitting in the shuk in Kesaria, a pitra de Beit Midrash, by the entrance to the Beit Midrash. Nafik Rabbi Ami, ashkachinu. So Rabbi Ami goes out and sees them standing outside the Beit Midrash. Amar lahu, he says to them, he reprimands them. Lava mina lechu beida Beit Midrasha? Beida Beit Midrasha lo tkimu abarai? Did I not tell you that when the Beit Midrash is in session, you shouldn't stand outside? You should be inside. We need you. Dilma ike inish demitzdarcha leishmata. Maybe there'll be someone who needs a tradition. He needs to know, what do we do? What did you learn about this? And he'll be very disturbed the fact that he doesn't know. And you guys have the traditions. You know a lot. You could help them. So don't stand outside the Beit Midrash. So in reaction to his reprimanding, Rabbi Zera goes in. Rabbi Abba lo Abba. Rabbi Abba doesn't go in. I don't know if he was offended. I don't know what, but not only does he not go in, he seems to go home, as we'll see from the continuation. Yatve, so Rabbi Zera is sitting there, V'kamabailu, and they ask him a question. What question? Exactly our question. Hey minayu acharita. Which was the last one that Rabbi did? Like Rabbi Meir or like the rabbis? Which one came second? Amar lahu Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera says to them, Lo shavatun li d'ishale l'saba. I can't believe you didn't give me the chance. You asked me now when it's too late. I would have asked Saba, the elder, Rabbi Abba. He would know. Dilma Shmiel, or maybe maybe Shmi alei me'avua. In other words, too bad you didn't ask me when Rabbi Abba was still here, which is kind of ironic because Rabbi Ami said you should be in the Beit Midrash in case they have questions, and then they were outside, and right, and he's saying too bad you didn't ask me when I was outside, but that was the whole point. Why don't you come inside? If you would come inside, you would have been there with Rabbi Abba, and maybe Rabbi Abba would have known. So anyway, he says, too bad you didn't ask me then, because maybe he heard it from his father, Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Favua mined Rabbi Yochanan, and he would have maybe heard it from Rabbi Yochanan. So maybe he would be able to ask his father. His father would ask Rabbi Yochanan. Not he would ask, but he would know it. Now, sorry, not that he would ask his father. If he would ask Rabbi Abba, he would have known from his father, and his father would have known from Rabbi Yochanan. How do we know this? Besides that he quoted Rabbi Yochanan earlier in today's daf, but Rabbi Chia bar Abba kol taltin yomin kama hadr talmude kamei Rabbi Yochanan. Every 30 days he would go review his Torah before Rabbi Yochanan. So meaning he would go over it, and Rabbi Yochanan would correct him if he was wrong. Okay, so that was a story that we brought to show that someone else had the same question, but it wasn't the general use of a tashma, which is let's go bring a source that has something to do to help us in some way. Sometimes it's a question, sometimes it's an answer. This case, it was just someone else asked the same question. So now they say, Mai havi ala. Okay, so what's the story? Tashma, they say, let's learn from here. Dishalach Rabbi Elazar legola. He sent to the Gola, he sent a letter saying, Hora Rebbe ki Rabbi Meir. He said, Rebbe taught like Rabbi Meir. Now, if Rebbe taught like Rabbi Meir, Rebbe taught like the rabbis, well, he also taught like the rabbis. So why did he specifically send he held like Rabbi Meir? So it must be, he said what was the last thing Rebbe said, and that's why he taught everybody that way. Which means that the Chereshot Bakatan Shchita, if nobody was watching, is a nevela, and then wouldn't be obligating Kisoy Adam, and wouldn't be obligating Otovet Beno. Okay, new Mishnah. Shachat mea chayot b'yom echad, kisoy echad kulam. If you slaughter 100 chayot in one day on domesticated animals, you do one covering the blood for all of them. Mea ofot b'makom echad, same thing with birds, 100 in one place, kisoy echad kulam, you just cover the blood at the end. Chayav va'of b'makom echad. What if you do a combo of an undomesticated animal and a bird? Kisoy echad kulam, one time for all of them. You can mix them. But on this point, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda omer shachat chaya yichasena. First the chaya, cover the blood, and after you finish covering the blood, then you do the bird. You don't cover them together. So now we're going to bring a braita with the background to their debate. Tana Rabbanan, chaya, kol mashma chaya, be'meruba, be'mu'ed. Because it just says chaya, general term, sounds like even many chayot, whether a lot, whether a few. Of, kol mashma of, okay, it sounds like, again, any bird. This is in the pasuk about Kisoy Adam. It says chaya, o, of. So bird, any kind of bird, whether it's many, whether it's few. Mikanamru, from there we learn, shachat mea chayot b'makom echad, kisoy echad kulam. The halacha in our Mishnah, you do 100, just one kisoy at the end. Mea ofot b'makom echad, kisoy echad kulam. Now that's just telling you the halachot in the Mishnah that came from that pasuk. 100 birds in one place, one kisoy. Chayav of b'makom echad, if you have a chayan and of, kisoy echad kulam, also one time to cover all of it. Here comes Rabbi Yehuda again, and now we're going to see his proof. Rabbi Yehuda omer, shachat chaya yichasena, v'achar kach yishchot et ha'of, okay, cover the undomesticated animal, then slaughter the bird. Shenemal, chaya o of. It splits them with the word or meat. We separate them. Amru lo, they said to him, harei omer, ki nefesh kol basar, damo b'nafshahu. They quote him the next pasuk, which is the soul of every flesh. Its blood is in its soul. And that's their proof against Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, that doesn't make any sense, to which the Gemara asks, my kama hadrele. What are the rabbis answering? What kind of an answer is that? Well, to explain that, the Gemara is going to say there must have been more discussion back and forth, and they're going to add some words here and some back and forth. Hachi ka'amrele Rabbanan. This is what Rabbanan said. You said oh, and that means chaya and of separately. Hi oh mibayle lechalek. You need the o to tell you you're not going to be, you might, if it didn't say oh, it would said chaya and of. And what would you have thought? You need to do both an undomesticated animal and a bird in order to be obligated to cover the blood. And that's obviously not true. So you need the o to separate them to tell you that. For Rabbi Yehuda, lechalek midamo nafka. Rabbi Yehuda says, I don't need that o for that reason. The o is unnecessary because you learn that from damo. It says its blood. Its blood is singular. That means only a chaya or only an of separately. So I don't need that. Now, when they quote the pasuk at the end, they're having the final word, which is the word damo, and that pasuk could be understood also in the plural form, because all basar, all flesh, it's blood, but its blood must mean their blood. So that's not a good proof, they say to him, and damo could mean many, in which case, oh, we really need to tell you either a chaya or an oaf, still you would have to cover the blood, but if you do them together, you just have to cover the blood once for all of them. Amar Rabbi Chanina. Now we're going to end with this last section. Rabbi Chanina says, Modeh haya Rabbi Meir liyan bracha, she'eno mavrech ela bracha achat. Now, even though he says, do the chaya, cover the blood, then do the oaf, and cover the blood. Well, you don't have to make one blessing. You don't have to make separate blessings on the slaughtering of the bird, even though you kind of took a break in between by covering the blood. Now, if you slaughter 100 animals, you basically do one bracha ala shchita, and that's it. And you just slaughter the birds. But he says, even if you stop in the middle and cover the blood, right now, obviously the rabbis who do all your chayot and all your afod and only cover the blood at the end, obviously you can do one bracha on the shchita. But even Rabbi Yehuda says you take a break, cover the blood, and then go back to slaughtering, you don't have to make a new bracha on the second slaughter. To which, Amrle Ravina Rav Acha B'rei Rava, or Amrle Rav Acha B'rei Rava Rav Ashi, either Ravina or Rav Acha asked this question. Why is this any different than the students of Rav? Now we'll go to Sugya and Brachot. The Rabrot of Rav Chananel Tamidei de Rav Havuyat ve'basudata. So these people were sitting, these students of Rav were sitting at a meal. Kaim alei Rav Yeba Saba. Rav Yeba Saba got up. Amalei Hav levorech. He says, let's say Birkat Hamazon. We're done with the meal. Hadr Amalei Hav lishte. Well, then later they said, you know what, we want to drink. Amarhu Rav Yeba Saba. He said, Hachi Amarav. You know, Rav said, Kevan de Amar Hav livarech. Because I said we're going to make Birkat Hamazon, and we kind of ended the meal. You can't drink any wine unless you make another bracha, because this is what we call hesech hadat. Your bracha that you had before, which you had in mind to do for your whole meal, but your meal ended by saying we're going to make a Birkat Hamazon, we're going to bench. So now you need to make a new bracha. So why is that any different? Hakanami say the same thing here. Since you since you stopped to do kisoy and you're dealing with covering the blood, isn't that a break? Isn't that like you broke between the first shchita and the second shchita, and don't you have to make another bracha on the second shchita? So why would he say that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't require that? And for the answer to that question, you'll have to wait till the next daf. Okay, so what we started with is the story with Rabbi Chia and the moths, and how he basically did he tell him either trough the animal or nechor the animal, stab it, or turn it into a treifa, so that you don't have to cover the blood. And then we showed in the end both Girsa'ot think either treifa or nechira would have precluded you from having to do kisoy adam, but they wanted to each version stress a different aspect of it, saying, oh, this is a bigger chiddush, or that's a bigger chiddush. And that had to do with, do you say that, right, shchita la'of min Torah or not? And do you say that shchita that's not a valid shchita, is that called shchita or not? Okay, related to those debates. We had a side question about how did he end up with the moths at all? Wasn't he the guy who resolved all those problems for people? And we said, well, for everyone else, but not for him. Then we talked about the chereshot and katan. That's basically what we dealt with this whole shiur about. Number one, the machloket, Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, about, right, if they do a non-valid shchita because no one was watching it, are you obligated in kisoy adam? Are you obligated in otov epino? Is it considered enough of a shchita or is it not? Right? And Rabbi Meir, we end up saying he thinks it's really an avela, which is why he doesn't think it. He's lenient in all these cases. And the rabbis, even though it wasn't clear they argued in both cases, in the end we proved they do argue in both cases. And we went through what was Rabbi Meir's reason, right? The rabbis, or maybe they did do a good shchita and then you'd be obligated. Rabbi Meir is saying, we go by the majority of these kids, really, minors and cherushim and shotim don't really know how to slaughter. And the majority of them, connected with the majority of the chazaka of most animals are not kosher, pushes us over the edge to say nevela. Even though Rabbi Meir could have maybe said minority, we prove why he really couldn't have said that. And then we got to how many animals can you slaughter, a whole bunch of animals at once, right? And then just do the kisoy at the end, so you can. But machloket about whether you can combine an oaf and a chaya or not. And end it with this issue. Even if you think you have to separate and cover the blood, you don't have to make a new blessing after that. And we're not really sure why. And that we're going to see in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov.